Today in the Bible story, we have got to cover a lot of time that passed in the Bible, because I try to tell Christmas stories at Christmas time, and the Christmas stories are farther on in the Bible, so we have to hurry through this section. I don't do that every year. We usually take a little more time here, but I have to hurry through this section. But let me remind you of how the story is being told. It's a continuing story that God spoke to a man called Abraham, and he gave him a promise. He said, you will have descendants. Descendants is an important word. It means the children of children of children of children. Those are descendants. You will have descendants, and they will become a great nation. I will give them a land to live in, and they will be a blessing to the whole world. And many people, when they read this, only look at land and nation, but the real reason that God chose the nation and gave them a land is so he could use them to be a blessing to all of the world. And so that's what God is doing in the Bible. In spite of man's sin, our wrongdoing, God is determined to bring us a blessing. And so our story goes from Abraham, and then we recently told you the story about how Abraham's descendants came to the land of Egypt, where they became slaves. And then God sent a man named Moses, who performed many miracles and brought them out of Egypt so they would no longer be slaves and become a new nation. And this man, Moses, that God had sent, gave them God's law written on stone. The law was to become a foundation for them as a nation. And the Ten Commandments are the most famous laws that have ever been written. And you can find them in your Bible or in many other places. And God gave Moses the law written on stone. And now we have to jump forward 400 years for today. 400 years is a long time. The United States has not been here for 400 years. So what happened in these years? Main things. Moses died, and Joshua, who was the student of Moses, he led the people of Israel to conquer the land that God had given to Abraham. And Israel, eventually, after many years, chose a king named Saul. They wanted to have a king. They weren't satisfied just to serve God. And they chose a king named Saul because he was tall and handsome. He looked like a king. But Saul disobeyed God. He was a sinner. But he disobeyed God in a way that disqualified him from being king. And so God said, I will choose a new king after my own heart. That is one that thinks like I think and wants the things that I want. And so God said he would choose this new king, and this story today is how that person became king in Israel. There was a man in Israel whose name was Jesse. Jesse lived in a small town of Bethlehem, and he had many sons. We know the names of 8 of them. And he had many sons, and God spoke to the high priest, whose name was Samuel. And he said, Samuel, take some oil, put it in a horn, and go to Jesse's house, and there I will show you the one I have chosen to become king. Now, the oil was to be poured on the head, and it's an old custom in that part of the world. The oil meant that God's blessing and God's spirit was being put on that person. And so it was something like putting a crown on his head in modern days. So old Samuel went to Jesse's house, and he saw that first son, and the first son was like Saul. He was tall and handsome. He said, surely this must be the one. But God's Spirit spoke to Samuel and said, don't pay any attention to how tall and handsome he is. I have rejected him. He's not the one. Because I do not judge people as people judge. The people had chosen someone who was tall and handsome. God said, I don't make my choices like that. But they look on the outward appearance. But I, that is God, looks on the heart. This tells us a lot about God. He really doesn't care whether you are short or tall or male or female or handsome or not so handsome. What he cares about is the intentions of your heart. Where does your heart lie? God says he looked at the heart. And so he said, I will show you another one. And so Samuel went to the second son, and God said, that's not the right one. And the third son, not the right one. Fourth son, no. Fifth son, no. Sixth son, no. Seventh son, no. And Samuel looked up at Jesse and said, he knew God had sent him to choose one of Jesse's sons. And he says, don't you have anybody else? Jesse says, yes. The youngest one is still out in the fields with the sheep. And Samuel says, call him. And they waited until the youngest one came, and God looked at him and said, this is the one. And he told Samuel, take your horn, pour the oil on his head. This is my chosen king. That person's name was David. And he became one of the most famous people in all of the Bible and in all of history. Well, this was God's choice, but it happened privately. How was this little shepherd boy, this youth, supposed to become king of Israel? Well, it happened like this. At that time, there was a war between Israel and their neighbors called the Philistines. They had a leader in their army who was a giant named Goliath. And he challenged Israel's army to a fight. He said, come out, send your strongest man, send your best warrior to me, and I will fight him, and whoever wins will win it all. We won't have to kill everybody. And he did that for 40 days. And people went, who's going to fight him? But the people were all afraid of him, including King Saul, who was tall and handsome. Saul was afraid of him too. This is what Goliath was like. His equipment, the Bible said, he had a spear, he had a sword, and he had armor that covered his body. Most of the Israelite soldiers did not have that. They were mostly just farmers and shepherds that had been gathered together at the call of the king to defend the nation. And so he had better weapons, and he was big. The Bible says he was almost 10 feet tall, about 3 meters tall. How tall is 3 meters? Very tall.
I'm not very.
How tall are you?
I'm 4'11".
You're 4'11". Okay, you're even smaller. Let me come here. Come here for a moment. This is my beautiful wife. She is 5.
10 feet tall.
She is, what, 5'3"?
Well, one time I was 5'1".
Oh, she's a little shorter than that. All right. The average man at the time of David was about that much taller than her, shorter than I am. We know that because archaeologists are the people who dig up old cities and bones and other things. They have found the remains of the bones of bodies of people from that time, and they measure the bones. And on average, men, not women, men were about this tall, 5'4", shorter than I am. I would have been a tall man. All right. I looked around on the internet to find a man who was 5'4". And I did. This smaller man, whose name is Kevin Hart, is a comedian. He makes people laugh. And I found this picture of Kevin Hart standing by another man whose name is Shaquille O'Neal, famous basketball player. He's no longer playing. But Shaquille O'Neal is about 2 meters 20 tall. And you can see how much bigger he is. But Shaquille O'Neal is not the biggest man, not even in basketball. This is him standing beside, does anyone know his name? Yao Ming, from China. Yao Ming was shorter than Goliath. If we put Goliath there, he would be as much taller than Yao Ming is than Shaquille O'Neal. Everyone was afraid of him. I would not want to fight either one of them. Now let me give you an English word. It's kind of a slang word that you hear with English speakers, but you may not find it in the dictionary. The word is puny. Did you say puny? Puny. Okay. The word puny means small and weak, or maybe even sickly. Not strong, not worldly. And the Bible doesn't use that word, but what happened was that the giant Goliath, with his armor and his spear and his sword, went out and told the Israelites what he thought of them. He said, "You soldiers are puny, and your God is puny. Come out and fight me." And no one would fight him. But about that time, little David, young David, was sent by his father to take some food to his brothers who were at the front of the war. And David came and he heard the man Goliath telling the people that their God was puny, and he was offended. And he went to the king, and he said to the king, "Who is this who defies the armies of the living God? Goliath is big, but God is even bigger." And Saul said, "Well, would you like to fight him?" He said, "Yes, I will fight him. As a shepherd, I've been in the field, and I have fought lions and bears and beat them so that they would not eat my sheep. The God who delivered me from them will deliver me from this giant." And so Saul said, "All right, you take my weapons, you take my spear, my sword, my armor." And David tried it, and it was too big and heavy because he was still young. He couldn't use it. But he said, "I will use what I'm used to using." And that was a sling and a staff. A stick and a sling. You've seen these people with slings throwing rocks. Okay. As a shepherd boy, he used them to chase away wolves and foxes and other things that were bothering his sheep. And he was a good shot. So he took his sling and his staff and no armor, and he went out into the field, and he defied Goliath. He said, "You have come to me to fight me with swords and spear, but I come to fight you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel's armies. You have defied him. Today, the Lord," referring to God, "will hand you over to me, and then all the world will know that Israel's God is true, for the battle belongs to God." He understood that it didn't matter what people do, but it matters what God does. So he went out against the giant, and little David against the giant threw his spear, and David pointed the spear, and then he took his sling, and he threw a stone, and hit the giant right in the head, right there. And the giant fell on his face. David ran up, took the giant's own sword, and cut off his head. When the Philistine army saw that, they began to run away. And when the Israelites saw that, they began to run after the Philistines. And that day they had a great victory. And David became famous in Israel. After some time, King Saul died in a battle against the Philistines. The Philistines were not totally defeated that day. And King Saul died in a battle against them. And the people remembered David. They chose him to be king just as God had planned. David was a great king and made Jerusalem the capital of his kingdom. And God's promise to David was this. He said, the Lord himself will make you a house. When your time comes to die, I will raise up after you your descendant. That's the child, the child, the child, the child. And I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Means for all time. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. But there was still a problem. It was a marvelous promise that God gave, but there was still a problem. And the problem was the same problem we chased all the way back to the first stories when Adam and Eve sinned and they brought death. And then Adam and Eve's children killed the other. And then people got so violent that God had to destroy the world. David, God's chosen king, later in his rage, stole a man's wife and killed her husband. David, the king, was a sinner. Solomon, who was David's son, who's also called Solomon or Suleiman in various languages, was the king after his father David. Solomon had 1,000 wives.
Wow.
One's enough for me. And he allowed them to bring false gods into Jerusalem and let people worship the false gods. Solomon was a sinner. And after that, there were many kings followed after Solomon and David, and some seemed to be good and some were bad, but they were all sinners. None of them did everything that was right. And finally, God allowed a foreign power to capture Jerusalem and destroy the temple of God. Where was a king good enough to rule in God's kingdom? That was the problem. And that will lead us into next week's story.